Welcome to Viewpoints. I'm Heather Isvaron, and with us today is Dr. Kalev Sepp, Assistant Professor for Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School. Welcome, Dr. Sepp.
Good to be here, Heather.
Thank you. Today we're going to talk about the war in Iraq and some of the things that maybe the American people and Homeland Security officials in general should know. And first and foremost, what are the basics? What do Americans need to know as they watch events unfold in Iraq?
Well, the first thing is there's not one war in Iraq. There's 4 wars going on at the same time. One is against the Sunni resistance, the Baathists, the diehards. One is against the foreign terrorists that are coming into the country on their jihadi mission to get combat experience before they return to Europe and North Africa. Another war is a war of intervention between the Sunni and Shia death squads to try and keep them from conducting genocide and murder against opposing political groups. And then the 4th war is against armed criminal organizations that are very deadly and very widespread.
Well, understanding that there is more complexity than time allows, could you give us a basic primer on the differences between the Shia and the Sunni?
This is primarily not a religious struggle, but a political struggle between political groups that are defined in part, but not wholly, by their religious affiliation. These 2 denominations of Islam, but there's deeper ethnic issues at play here, and fundamentally, during the Saddam regime, for the 30 years before the American and coalition invasion, the favored group, the ruling group in Iraq were the Sunnis, which constituted actually a minority, only about 20% of the population. But Saddam, through his various power mechanisms, favored the Sunnis and suppressed the Shia and the Kurds, which constitute the other 80% of the country. Now that there has been an overturning of government and democracy is being felt in some measure, the Sunnis feel that that in retribution for the 30 years that they oppressed the Shia, is that they are now going to suffer as victims of a rising Shia oppression, as part of a revenge that is going to be visited on them. And so they're fighting back. Some of that's fueled by the Sunnis' own misunderstanding of their role. Many of them have very racist views, that they're the natural leaders of the country. And there's a saying among Sunnis that Sunnis rule, Shias serve. But what they're finding out is the Shia that they've tried to repress again through internal violence are fighting back and are inflicting horrific murders on their people as well.
Well, you mentioned the Kurds, and how do they fit in?
Oh, the Kurds have managed to position themselves very cleverly in all this and make themselves autonomous from most of the Sunni and Shia violence. Internally, they were able to secure the northern portion of the country through a very strict security force regime. And so there are very, very low levels of violence there, except on the periphery of the Kurdish zone, where they're conducting a non-violent ethnic cleansing of the cities and towns on the edges of their territory to purge them of Sunni and Shia people and establish Kurdish hegemony.
So you mentioned democracy, and how do you think that fits with these very, complex situations that are happening over there?
Democracy is not a tradition in Iraq. Iraq has been ruled by a series of strongmen through history, and of course only recently, just in this century, has it been unified in the political body that it has, which was actually 3 separate provinces under the old Ottoman regime that the Turks oversaw. The idea of democracy is not appealing to everybody in the country, particularly minority groups like the Sunnis.
And what kind of outcome do you think, nobody's a fortune teller, of course, nobody knows the future, but do you think that this is a long-term engagement in terms of decades, or do you have any kind of long-term forecasts?
The essence of the the political problem inside Iraq right now is a struggle over oil, control of the revenues that come from oil, and political power. And those two are very, very closely allied. The Shia have oil. The Kurds have oil in the regions where they are dominant. But the Sunnis out in the western part of the country feel that they have none. And again, under what they perceive as their understanding of democracy is they're a minority, so they have to subject themselves to the will of the majority, and that they're not going to get any of these revenues. And so the reconciliation that that's been recommended in the Iraq Study Group report that came out just 2 weeks ago is that a power sharing and oil revenue sharing plan be put in place.
And what do you think of that proposal?
Well, since I was an expert member of the Iraq Study Group, not that I agree wholly with all of the 79 recommendations that the commissioners made, but it's a very cogent plan. It is unified. It is a real strategy. I know that General Barry McCaffrey recently said he didn't think it was a strategy, but it sure looks like a strategy to me. It has an objective, an ends, and proposes very distinct ways and means to achieve those ends. So it addresses political issues, economic issues, and security issues comprehensively. You can argue some of the details. Not everybody's going to like all aspects of it, but that's a good way, I think, to proceed. In terms of the way American policy ought to be shaped. What the outcome of all that will be is not going to be anything that that somebody might call victory. It's much more realistic to think of what American interests must be served in the region, and at the same time, how can we meet the obligations that we created for ourselves to Iraq by coming in and tearing down one government and its economic structure and much of its social structure. What in all of that do we have to repair before we disengage? And so that speaks to a very long-term engagement over not just of military forces in some degree or fashion, but also politically.
So what does the war in Iraq, what effect does that have for Homeland Security professionals here in the States?
Probably the most significant is in mentioning to you that there were 4 wars at the same time in Iraq. The one that involves foreign terrorists is particularly troubling. These are young Muslim radicals that are coming primarily out of Europe and the northern tier of Africa into Iraq to get combat experience. They don't expect necessarily to win or to overturn the government, but they just want to fight against the Americans. Now, the good news is, such as it is that about 80% of them are killed in Iraq because they arrive untrained and very naive about how capable the American forces are, and find themselves not actually very well supported by the Iraqis because they are seen as foreigners and intruders in almost the same way that the Americans are. But the problem is the 20% of the several hundred a month that come into Iraq that do get out and the profile of these terrorists is what's called clean skin. They have no police records in their home country. They have no other violations. They've come and gone from Iraq without that being recorded anywhere, because it's very easy to get into Iraq, particularly through Syria, without any documentation of their travel. And so they return to Europe and Africa with no record of having been in Iraq and no other police record and no way to track them. But in fact, they have this tremendous set of combat experiences and a deepened belief in radical Islamic ideology.
So is there any evidence that those folks have come to the States and are indeed here?
Great question. I don't know that specifically, but of course the point would be people that have no police records and no reason to be barred from entry to the United States could very easily enter the United States.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sepp, for your time today and your expertise.
Heather, thank you very much.